Welcome to We Won't Pay, War Tax Resistance 101 and Trump's Agenda. My name is Erica Weiland. I will be your presenter today. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a disclaimer before we get started. So this webinar is about telling you how war tax resistors and folks affiliated with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee have done their resistance and what we've learned. If you refuse to pay taxes that the IRS says you owe, it's an act of civil disobedience, and there can be a variety of consequences. So we believe that nonviolent direct action is a powerful tool, and we support folks who wish to join us in this kind of resistance. But we're not tax advisors, and we can't tell you for sure how the IRS will react to any resistance you undertake. And we'll tell you more about what the risks and what the benefits are to your conscience of being a war tax resistor as we go along. The choice of whether to resist, how to resist, and what risks to take on is up to you. So we're going to be talking today about what the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee is, where we are today as a movement that in relationship to the Trump administration, growing militarism and antagonism and so on, why we resist, the history of war tax resistance, the breakdown of taxes, how to resist, risks and consequences, and questions and answers. So the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, or called NWTRCC for short, is a coalition of groups across the United States that has worked for almost 35 years this year, in fact, to support people who pay taxes, who refuse to pay taxes for war and violence. Our statement of purpose reads, NWTRCC sees poverty, racism, sexism, homophobia, economic exploitation, environmental destruction, and militarization of law enforcement as integrally linked with the militarism which we abhor. Through the redirection of our tax dollars, NWTRCC members contribute directly to the struggle for peace and justice for all. And so NWTRCC's message is becoming more and more relevant all the time. In this time of Trump, we're seeing increased deportations from ICE. We're seeing an agenda that empowers police to further criminalize protesters. We're seeing executive orders that empower police officers to take more violent action against people. We're seeing immigration orders that target Muslim people around the world from countries that have often been targeted by the United States in military actions. We're seeing companies that are profiting from this escalation. All these things that I'm talking about, they're nothing new. They existed under the Obama administration. They existed under the Bush administration, but these are issues that are growing and are of increasing concern to folks under Trump. So private prison companies are set to profit from the increased detention of immigrants. And Trump is calling for increased military spending and calling for a military buildup that is quite much larger than anything we've seen in the last several years. So he wants to boost the military spending by $500 billion to $1 trillion. And that's a fair amount of money because the United States spends as much on, quote, defense as the next 9 countries combined. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world, and private companies are profiting off of that. Incarceration is propped up by militarized police who are arresting people with impunity. Our military police in prisons and our military, police, and prisons all target Black, brown, and indigenous people. You can see from this graph, this is the U.S. versus the next 9 countries, and this number here, 581 billion, is actually only a portion, of the U.S.'s total military spending. So when we look at the entire military budget or spending related to the military, it's even higher. So this situation is a disaster, but it's also a problem for each of us personally. It's not enough to oppose this evil rhetorically. It's not enough just to say we're not going to grant it our moral support. If we protest against it, we're still supporting it if we are fueling this with our tax dollars. This is a quote from one of the founders of the modern war tax resistance movement, Juanita Nelson. While the seat of the government is in Washington, the seat of conscience is in me. It cannot be voted out of office by 1 or a million others. So we talked about some reasons why we resist already. The National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee was founded specifically around military spending, comes out of movements that opposed war taxes in Vietnam, for the Vietnam War and other wars, for opposing military expenditures that were used for repression in Central America in the 70s and 80s and onward. So we come from a place of starting with the military budget. The military budget is enormous, but there are many other things that are related to militarization that come with that. Border militarization and deportations, that wall that Trump wants to build. The federal prisons, just like the military-industrial complex, prisons are profiting off of incarceration and the criminal justice system. We're seeing the militarization of the police at Standing Rock. We're seeing the effects of occupation and colonization, both in the U.S. and around the world. Not just what the U.S. is doing right now, but also the long-term effects of a long-term history of occupation and colonization. And as the climate justice movement grows, many people are concerned about the impact of war on the environment. The Pentagon is the largest single user of oil in the world. And you can see from this graph that from the War Resisters League that 44% of every income tax dollar goes to pay military expenses. So we've seen that $589 billion for past military and then $768 billion for current military. So past military is stuff like veterans benefits. So when we send people to war, we have to pay for their long-term treatment from the harm that war causes them. And then also interest on the debt that we go into in order to pay for the wars. And then current military is often more what we think about when we think about the military budget. It's the Department of Defense, it's Department of Energy spending on nuclear, it's border militarization in the Department of Homeland Security, and a few other things. So war tax resistance has, as I alluded to earlier, has a long history in this country, on this land before there was a country called the United States. In 1637, the Algonquin tribe were what we call the first people to resist a war tax levied on them on the continent. Of course, they weren't subject, to Dutch rule, but they refused to pay the tax that they were, that the Dutch were telling them to pay. In the 1800s, Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Civil Disobedience, which is a pretty widely read essay, he spent a night in jail for his refusal to pay a war tax. In 1915, the Women's Tax Resistance League vowed that if they didn't get the vote, they weren't going to pay taxes. In 1930, we know about Gandhi's independence campaign in India, and they had the Salt March to make salt and avoid the British taxation on salt. During the Vietnam War, hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. refused to pay taxes because of the Vietnam War. This is probably the largest event of war tax resistance in this country. And then also tax resistance, again, is being used around the world. The village of, I'm probably going to mangle this, Beit Sahur in Palestine withheld taxes from the Israeli occupation. They said, we won't finance the bullets that kill our children. So war tax resistors today are following in this legacy of resistance to taxes that fund state violence, that fund war. So we focus on individual income taxes because it's the largest source of revenue for the federal budget. Individual income tax in 2015 provided over $1.5 trillion to the federal budget. Social insurance taxes, that means like Social Security and Medicare taxes that come out of your paycheck, that was over $1 trillion. Corporate income tax was only $344 billion, and other taxes that added to the federal budget were $299 billion. So individual income tax, largest single source of revenue for the budget. This is one reason why it makes sense for folks to consider resisting those taxes. So we're going to talk a little bit about methods of resistance. It's probably on everybody's mind here. Different resistors have different goals in what they're doing. Some folks are concerned about making a protest. They want to tell the government that they protest military spending. Some people are concerned with nonviolent resistance. So it's important to them to resist what's happening with indirect action. And many folks are concerned about conscientious objection. Their conscience won't allow them to pay for war. If they wouldn't fight in a war, many folks say, why would we pay to send other people to war? Other things to keep in mind are risk tolerances. So how willing are you to break the law? How much are you willing to resist? And values that you want your resistance to represent. And you also have to consider your life situation. So dependence, retirement, self-employment, income sources, citizenship status, and other issues that might affect what type of resistance you decide you want to take. We often say in war tax resistance circles that there are about as many methods to resist war taxes as there are resistors. And indeed, each of us does this slightly differently. So what we're going to talk about here is just two broad strokes of common ways to resist. One is refusing to pay some or all of the income taxes you owe, and either filing or not filing a tax return. So refusal to pay some or all of the income taxes that you owe is civil disobedience, comes along with certain risks and consequences, and we'll get into that more as we go. Another common method is to earn less than a taxable income. So if you earn less than the IRS can tax, then this is a legal method of resistance. It doesn't come with consequences from the IRS, but it might come with consequences for your lifestyle. And some folks earn less than a taxable income by choice, and others in terms of that's the jobs that they can find and the income that they can make. But those folks are still if you have the intention to refuse to pay war taxes, then no matter what your situation, whether you would owe taxes or not, you're a war tax resistor. This picture here shows the founders of the modern war tax resistance movement. So we saw Juanita Nelson, second from the left there. She's pictured with her partner Wally Nelson, and also you can see Ernest Bromley, Marion Bromley, and Maurice McCracken. These folks have a lot to do with the way that we practice war tax resistance today, and we're really grateful to them for all their knowledge and hard work and resistance. So, if you are an employee, there are things that you can do to prepare to resist war taxes. So you don't, for many folks, especially this year, we're coming up on the end of February. Many folks have already paid income taxes in 2016 through those federal withholdings that you see on your paycheck. So if you filled out a W-4 form when you started your job, it's likely, although not certain, that you have federal taxes withheld from your paycheck. So you can change the number of allowances on a new W-4, and we have resources to tell you in more detail how you might do that to reduce or eliminate your withholding. So the more allowances that you take, the less amount of your income that is subject to taxation. So you can choose to reduce or eliminate your withholding through increasing those allowances. And then it's your choice next year, so in 2018, to choose to resist paying taxes when you file. You can choose to pay some of it. You can choose to pay none of what you owe. At that point, the choice is up to you. So W-4 changes, W-4 resistance, as we call it, is a really great way to start to prepare for being a resistor. And you can choose not to resist if it doesn't work for your circumstances. Even if the government gives you a full refund of your federal withholding every year, if you get a big check when you file, back from the IRS when you file, you're basically giving the government a free loan to spend on war and violence. So it makes sense to consider whether you're comfortable giving the government that loan, 44% of which is going to go to pay for war. So just to show you what this might look like on your paycheck, so you'll see this line over here that says federal withholding. And then you'll see what you paid on the current paycheck, and you might also see a year-to-date amount. This is your federal income tax withholding. This is the amount of which 44% is going to the military and military-related causes. And as I mentioned, the more allowances you take, the less income tax is withheld. So if you're curious about W-4 resistance, then I highly recommend you head over to our website and read more about that to figure out what's going to work for you. And then if you are self-employed, so if you're self-employed or work as a contractor or consultant, you may have filled out a W-9 at the start of your work with each client. A W-9 gives the client your social security number, your business identification number, and then your client is then, if they pay you over $600 in a year, your client then is required to file a 1099 form to report your income to the IRS. If you're self-employed, if you get W-9, 1099 form income, you're responsible for paying or not paying all your own taxes. That includes the Social Security and Medicare, which is normally withheld from a paycheck, as well as federal income tax withholding. Taxes aren't withheld from your income automatically. Some people choose to work in under-the-table jobs to keep their income invisible to the IRS, because if your clients file a 1099 form to report your income, then the IRS knows about that income that was paid to you. The same way that when your employer sends W-2s to the IRS, or when you send W-2s to the IRS with your tax form, then the IRS knows who paid you and how much. So that leads us to the next question here, which is filing taxes versus not filing. So some resistors file. They send accurately filled out tax return forms to the IRS, maybe with a letter of protest. So they're telling the IRS what income they made, and in many cases they're telling the IRS directly with that letter of protest why they aren't paying. So this is a way to voice dissent and practice open civil disobedience. It's possible, although again we can't make any guarantees about the IRS, it's possible that filing can make it easier for the IRS to find you. However, as I said, if you have a client or an employer that sends 1099 forms or W-2s to the IRS, then the IRS already knows about your income, whether or not you file a tax return as well. When you file a tax return, there is a 10-year statute of limitations for collection. So the IRS has 10 years to try to get that money from you from the various collection methods at their disposal. This can make it easier to apply for scholarships. Filing can make it easier to apply for scholarships, health insurance subsidies, etc. Some of those sorts of things want you to submit a tax return that you sent to the IRS in order to qualify for things. Some folks choose not to file. They don't send forms to the IRS. They feel that communicating with the IRS goes against their conscience, is something they're not willing to do. They don't want to cooperate with the government in any way. People have various reasons for not filing, but those are some of them. It's best to fill out your tax returns anyway, even if you choose not to file them, because if there's a difficulty with the IRS later, you want to have accurate records of what you actually made to prevent them trying to collect a larger amount than you would actually owe if you communicated with them. When you don't file, you can be harder to distinguish from others who refuse to pay taxes. You're not voicing reasons for your refusal to the IRS. Many folks who don't file choose to keep a lower profile with their resistance. It could make IRS collection harder, though, as I said, depending on the type of income that you make, if the IRS knows about it, then that can still be, then they can still find your income and find who paid you. If you don't file, there's no statute of limitations for collection. The IRS can come after you for a tax year, theoretically forever, for the rest of your life. They do have a 10-year statute of limitations, actually, but it only starts when the IRS files a tax return for you to estimate that. So they could choose to do that at any time. So you really don't know, you don't have a statute of limitations that you can count on when you are a non-filer. And the penalties can be higher. The monetary penalties for not filing, for not cooperating. So there are some myths about tax resistance that we want to address. A lot of folks are concerned that they're going to go to jail. Very few war tax resistors have gone to jail. Out of hundreds of thousands of war tax resistors over the past 80 years, only 2 people have gone to jail specifically for not paying taxes. Fewer than 100 have been taken to court, and often on other charges, such as failure to file, fraud, or falsifying tax documents. So, I mean, you should know that the chances of prosecution are higher if you commit fraud on a tax return, if you lie about your income, if you take deductions that you aren't entitled to, things like that. So sometimes folks go to court. Much more rarely folks go to jail. It's not a done deal that resistance means you're going to jail. It's very rare. You know, again, it depends on your personal situation as a resistor, but it's not a given at all. Many people are concerned that the IRS will take their house, their car, their property. Again, vast majority of our, you know, hundreds of thousands of war tax resistors that we know about over the past several decades have not had the IRS seize their property. While there are instances of the IRS doing this, these are few and far between, and the IRS rates of seizure of property have gone down significantly since the 1990s. It's actually very expensive for the IRS to seize property, so they are less likely to do that even than they were 20 years ago, when it was already fairly rare. Folks are often concerned that choosing to resist means the IRS will just end up getting more money in the end. Sometimes folks think the IRS is going to come out ahead if it manages to seize my bank account or garnish my wages or things like that, with interest and penalties. But in the aggregate, we found that resistors hold more money back from the IRS than they successfully seize. A few years ago, we did a survey at one of our war tax resistance gatherings, and we found that although folks estimated that they owed, in total, everyone present who filled out the survey estimated that they owed over $500,000, and the IRS had you know, only successfully seized a small portion of that. So in total, resistance works. It's less money going to war. Many people are concerned that war tax resistors don't pay for things that our society needs. In fact, we often redirect our money or our time or both to help meet pressing needs. Many folks who are resistors, we give that money to causes that we think are doing the better, more necessary work that our society needs in order to end, you know, poverty, war, and oppression. In this way, when we're resisting, our time and money serves society 100%. Instead of having 44% of it, or whatever the percentage is that year, serving the Pentagon, serving the Trump agenda, serving any president's agenda who's doing things that that we don't support. So I alluded to this a bit before. There are actual risks of war tax resistance. It's not for everyone. The most common thing that happens when you resist war taxes is that you get a string of letters from the IRS telling you, hey, you still owe this money. We're adding interest and penalties to this. We are thinking of levying your bank account or trying to find some money that we could use to pay off your back taxes. And sometimes they follow through. So there are risks involved that you should consider. These include salary garnishment. The IRS can come to your employer and say that you have back taxes and ask to garnish a portion of your wages in order to cover those back taxes. The IRS can find your bank account and take money out of it, especially if they know about a bank account that you've paid taxes from before. That makes it easier for them. There's the payment of interest and penalties. So if they do seize money from you, then they could end up seizing more money from you than you owed in the first place. Being a war tax resistor, and especially if you're a non-filer, can make it more difficult to get health insurance or student loans. If you're not a citizen, war tax resistance might have some risks for your green card status or visa status, or if you're undocumented, that can also be a risk. Also, the IRS can work with the State Department if you owe over $50,000. There is a mechanism for the IRS to revoke or refuse to renew your passport. This is a rare situation. That law was only recently passed about a year ago, so we don't know anyone who's been affected by that, but again, it's a possibility. And finally, there can be liens on your property that can affect your credit. And also, if you choose to sell that property, then the lien comes first in getting that money. Having said that, there are also benefits to war tax resistance in terms of being able to act in accordance with your conscience, in terms of being able to take a direct action that is in resistance to what the government is doing with our tax dollars. So there are also positives to being a war tax resistor, also a community of folks who are resisting. We have our gatherings twice a year, and those are really great community building opportunities for folks who are resisting. So I talked about redirection. So we can use these tax dollars to build the communities we want instead. This year, many war tax resistors in some different cities around the country are collectively redirecting tax dollars to Black, Brown, and Indigenous resistance. We're calling this collective redirection, and you can learn more about this during our next webinar on February 25th. If you haven't registered for the February 25th webinar, then you can go back to the link from which you originally registered for this webinar. That's tinyurl.com/WTR-webinars to register for the February 25th webinar. So groups of war tax resistors around the country are getting together to say, we know that our tax dollars are being used for militarism and state violence, and we know that this militarism and state violence targets Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in the United States and also around the world. And so this is one way in which we can start to counter the great injustices that are done with our tax dollars. So that is just a brief summary of what war tax resistance is. I'm guessing folks have a ton of questions. Before we get into the questions, I just want to let you know that there are lots more opportunities to learn more through the NWTRC website. That's www.NWTRCC.org. We have a lot of informative materials under the Resist and Resources sections. We have a newsletter that comes out every 2 months. We have a weekly blog. We have an occasional podcast. And we have a collection of interviews and articles that have been published in the media, around the internet, on the radio, and so forth. I mentioned NWTRC's gatherings. We have gathering twice a year. In May, we'll be meeting in St. Louis, Missouri. Also, tax day is coming up, and we'll be compiling a list of tax day activities that's both on tax day and workshops in local areas and events related to tax day. There's a lot of mobilization going on around taxes right now, both within our network and in other networks. So you might have heard about this, about mobilization on April 15th to ask Trump to release his tax returns. There is a group organizing around that called 100 Days of Resistance. You might also have heard about Gloria Steinem refusing to pay a portion of her taxes and sending them to Planned Parenthood. Mia Farrow made a statement about refusing to pay for the border wall. So we're hoping that we're going to see a lot of really amazing action around tax day, both within the New-TRIC network and outside of the New-TRIC network. We have affiliates around the country, and we have war tax resistance counselors. So these are folks who don't provide tax advice, again, as I said, but can let you know what we know about how the IRS operates and about, you know, the likely things that can happen with certain types of resistance and what the risks and consequences of those might be. And we also have war tax resistance literature and merchandise that you can pick up to use to do outreach in your own communities. So with that, we'll get into the questions. I'm going to check out what questions we have submitted by text, and then we'll look at the questions. We'll see if there are any audio questions. All right, so I have a question here that says, approximately how many war tax resistors do you believe there are around the country now, and how many new calls have you received following Trump's election? So we generally say about 10,000 war tax resistors, although it's really hard to know. You know, quite often our coordinator in New York gets calls from resistors that she's, you know, never heard of, people who've been resisting for years. So this is kind of based on roughly how many people we know in our network and, you know, just kind of estimating. But it's really hard to know. A lot of folks keep a low profile. We have been receiving a lot of new calls following Trump's election. In fact, things really took off in a big way in terms of visits to our website and emails. Some calls, but we're getting a lot of attention online, specifically through social media, through emails, and through various articles that are being written about tax resistance. The question is, another question is, do you have any template letters with language that resistors can use to formalize, standardize what we all write to the IRS so that they understand we are part of a larger movement versus individuals? We don't have template letters, but if you go to our website and you click on the heading resist, you'll see a heading that says letters to the IRS or letters from war tax resistors. And you can see a big list of letters that resistors have written to the IRS over the years. So what you want to write is up to you, but the IRS is aware of war tax resistors as a movement, so, you know, anything that you say to that effect, you know, we'll let them know that. One person asked if the slide presentation will be available on the website. We are going to release a recording of this webinar, yeah, I think we could probably put the slide presentation up on there. You'll see a lot of really great resources up on the website in the meantime, though. One person asks, if you don't mind sharing, I'm interested in hearing about any consequences you have personally dealt with as a resistor. So as a resistor personally, I have mostly just received letters from the IRS. Lots of letters, sometimes certified mail, so I have to sign for it. At one point they tried to levy a bank account, but it was a bank account that for unrelated reasons I had already closed. I know that the IRS is aware of me and that they're aware of my resistance, but it's not clear to me what the when or if they will try to collect on me again, what they'll try to do. So yeah, we'll just have to see what happens. Another person asks, if tax resistors cause a significant reduction in the federal revenues, won't they, especially in this era, simply redirect what taxes they do receive into the bad stuff, for example, the military, and cut social services even more than they are already planning to? That would mean our tax resistance would backfire. I would say that tax resistance is an act in which we're trying to get the government to, well, the goal for many of us is trying to get the government to take notice of us. And the point at which they take serious notice of us as a movement is a point at which we have more leverage to get them to stop what they're doing, to make these changes. The U.S. government also has they have, they're funding the military in some sense, out of debt, out of the debt that they're creating, or by using our taxpayer dollars. So in the sense that they can just spend the money elsewhere, then that might be a concern for you. For me, it's important simply to resist and to be public about the resistance, and to let them know that I'm opposed to this militarism, and to be part of what I'm hoping is going to be a growing movement of folks who are resisting. If we cause a significant reduction in the federal revenues, then I think they're going to be worried about the impact that we're having and want to do something to appease us, to get us to pay. So I think that would be a success point. Another person asks, does NWTRC provide help with filling out IRS forms, letters, appeals, etc.? So organizationally, no, we can tell you things that we know about filling out a tax form. And we have all the resources on our website that you can look at. For folks who need, who have legal questions, we do have lawyers in our network who can provide some input. But in general, we put out our information, and you can send us questions and stuff, but we don't provide help with filling out IRS forms or letters directly. Your resistance is something that you have to do, but we're more than happy to answer questions to the degree that we're able. Another question is, do you know legal ways for people to protect their assets by putting it into a trust? Similar to the last question, do we have any fear that people like Bannon and libertarians who want the government to collapse anyway will use these kind of actions to do the same if a more liberal government comes to power and or to accomplish what they want right now, the downfall of civil society? So some people do use trusts to protect their assets. and you can find out more about that on our website. Um, Specifically, I believe, let's see, it would be in one of our practical war tax resistance pamphlets. I think it's the one, I think it's number 3, How to Resist Collection or Make the Most of Collection When It Occurs. So I would take a look at the practical war tax resistance pamphlets for information on how other people have used trusts. In regards to the question about folks will use these same kind of actions to try to cripple the government or to impede the government, excuse me. I mean, I think some people have that fear, but war tax resistors are actually the longest going and most, we've been sticking with tax resistance for a long time and in a very principled way. Other folks and other movements have not yet picked up tax resistance as a strategy, and in fact, we're war tax resistors and folks who are resisting taxes for militarism and immigration and enforcement and the border wall and things like that are more commonly receiving criticism for using this strategy at this time. Many war tax resistors are not concerned about this at all and believe that anyone who has a genuine principled opposition to taxation for a purpose, that's a thing that they can do, and if they choose to take on that civil disobedience, then that's their right. But war tax resistance is, has been more organized and impactful, I would say, so far than those other tax resistance movements. Next question is, how much are the penalties for W-4 withholding? I heard that if you owe more than $1,000, then you have to pay some penalties. Exactly right. If you use W-4 withholding, or if as a self-employed person you do not file your quarterly estimated taxes, or actually as an employed person as well, if you don't pay estimated taxes or have automatic paycheck withholding, then there can be a penalty if the IRS says that you owe more than $1,000 at tax time. These penalties are fairly low in comparison to the amount of money that you would owe. We're talking on the order of, if you owed, say, $1,000 or $2,000, the penalty is something like $20, $30. So fairly small. Again, like other penalties, they can be, they can stack up over time and become more considerable, but the W-4 withholding penalty is fairly small in comparison to just failure to pay interest and penalties. Another question, well, actually, let me get over to the audio questions and just see if we have any questions from folks who are not on text. So if you are, let's see. I see we have it looks like we don't have any audio questions at this time, or else I'm not able to see them. I'm sorry if I'm missing anyone. I'm going to move on to the next text question. I did symbolic 10.4% or 1040 for the form 1040 resistance from 2003 to 2006 in response to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. I received streams of IRS letters as mentioned, but when I moved from California to Massachusetts, the IRS garnished my state refunds for 3 years straight until my debt was paid. Are there ways to prevent that? State taxes, unfortunately, are something that we don't know very much about organizationally. So I'm afraid I can't really provide any feedback on how to deal with that. I mean, generally, if you can figure out a way to not get refunds from your state taxes in the first place, then the IRS wouldn't be able to garnish the refund. But I'm not sure in your particular state and situation whether that's a possibility for you. Next question. How much control do I have if I choose to withhold only part of my taxes to direct the portion paid to social services? Great question. Different people choose to withhold different amounts. And I didn't talk about this very much, but you can choose to withhold a portion of your taxes, so the portion that goes to militarism. You can withhold a percent, like the person who withheld 10.4%. Some people don't pay any of their taxes under the theory that any taxes that they pay, a portion of that would still go to pay for militarism. So you don't have any control if you choose to withhold only part of your taxes to direct the portion that you paid to social services. Once the money goes to the IRS, you don't really have much control over that. Some people choose to do a sort of symbolic action where they write a check to the Social Security Administration, for example, or the Department of Health and Human Services. In general, the IRS will simply still deposit those checks. You could also choose to write a check to the government agency that you want to support directly and send it to them. But you don't have control when sending money to the IRS about who they will send the money to. Let's see, I see one online question. So I've unmuted you, Rachel.
Oh, hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I have a question more on kind of the spreading like more awareness and on education. I do a lot of research on you know what Congress is doing in the military, and I don't know if a lot of people are aware really of the think tanks that promote more military spending, more more perceived so-called threats where we have to spend more on military upgrades and so forth. And you know, a lot of people don't realize we have 1,200 military bases in the world, and also all the NATO along with the U.S. military buildup. So what is the best way to kind of spread more information on that sector? And then also a push right now in the Department of Defense is military recruitment, military recruiting in the public schools. They're giving kids, you know, vocational testing that for the Department of Defense, and military recruiters have full access. I mean, going down to elementary school in public schools, you know, trying to recruit as many kids as possible, which is, you know, disturbing to me personally. But a lot of people don't think about all of these other things that are contributing to this just insanity that's going on with military spending. And they are proposing a $1 trillion spending package to upgrade our nuclear weapons, which,
Mm-hmm.
you know, is just psychotic to me as well. So I wondered if, um, you know, with this organization, how can we get out more information of stuff that's going on under, you know, kind of behind the scenes? It's very elusive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that make
That's a great,
sense?
yeah, great question. Thank you. Um, so, I mean, generally, since NUTRIC is focused on war tax resistance in particular, we we're not the best folks to be focusing on getting that information out. Some other organizations that I know of that are doing good work in um, exposing some of these issues around militarism are Veterans for Peace, Iraq Veterans Against the War. Um, let's see, War Resisters League puts out the pie chart that we use every year to get out information um, about the extent of military spending. And so the back of that pie chart every year has different information about a particular issue to um, in terms of military spending. Um, so and nuclear weapons again is definitely an issue of great concern. I would point out that the nuclear budget, this $1 trillion proposal, did come out under President Obama. And so this is a long-standing issue, this idea that we need to do nuclear proliferation, not non-proliferation. A couple of organizations that put out great information about nuclear weapons are Nuke Watch and the Nuclear Resistor. So um, I would definitely recommend looking into those organizations for information about how to get, information and ideas for spreading the word about the those issues. In terms of counter recruitment, um, there's the National Network. I think it's the National Network on the Militarization of Youth. Has done some work around counter recruitment issues. But all of these issues are, tied into war tax resistance, and so if these issues are, specifically important to you, um, I urge you to use other organizations' literature in concert with ours. Here's all this nuclear spending that's being proposed, and look at how everyone is paying for it. Next question. Would moving bank accounts around every few months stifle the IRS? It could impede collection. There are some issues around that um, uh, in terms of um, if the IRS uh, um, if the IRS happens to know about the bank accounts that you're using, so if they're interest-bearing accounts and they earn more than $10 of interest in a year, then the bank is required to report that interest to the IRS, and many banks report just all interest-bearing accounts regardless. So you can't be sure that moving bank accounts will stifle the IRS, and efforts to impede collection can result in certain other legal difficulties with the IRS, trying to impede collection or dodge collection or things like that can potentially look bad in tax court if it came to that. So I would definitely recommend, again, looking at our practical war tax resistance number 3, how to resist collection or make the most of collection if it occurs, for more information on bank accounts or not using bank accounts or other things that you can decide whether the risks and benefits of those methods are appropriate for you. So for such a long-standing movement, do examples exist of ways in which tax resistance has had structural impact? So in the Vietnam War, during the Vietnam War, it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people were tax resistors. And in concert with all of the other resistance that was going on, and the very public ways in which prominent figures were resisting taxes, that was part of the movement that helped, bring so much public attention to the necessity to end the Vietnam War. Tax resistance, of course, had an impact in Gandhi's movement for India's independence. And it's an important, many of us believe that regardless of whether we can attach a specific impact to it, the act of resistance itself and refusing to cooperate is really important. And that when each of us individually takes an action that's in alignment with our conscience, then that can help build a movement, but it's important not to start from the idea that, is this going to be effective immediately or not? Many folks have tried to start large tax resistance movements saying, we'll all resist if and only if 100,000 people resist. And those, it's hard to get people to all agree to do something like that in concert. I think that one of the impacts of tax resistance is not just encouraging other folks to consider whether they want to take that action in alignment with their conscience themselves, but also encouraging other people to take other forms of resistance. If they see that we're willing to act in accordance with our conscience on one issue, they may be willing to attend a protest, do a sit-in, block a road, organize a movement that's related and has an impact. Are there any other questions on audio? It looks like I have exhausted our text questions. All right. Well, again, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. This is the first time we've done a webinar like this, and it's really exciting to see so many folks who are interested in this issue and, wanting to learn more. Oh, I see a question that I'll get to before we close out. Great question. Do you have local groups in cities with this movement? Yes, we do. And we are involved in trying to mobilize more local groups. So head to our website and click on the Contacts and Counselors link, and you will see a link to local groups in many cities around the country. Also links to those war tax resistance counselors. If you have questions, you may be able to meet with somebody in person or by phone close to you. When you get connected to folks close to you, maybe you'll be able to start your own local group. So please check out our Contacts and Counselors link. And if you want to get connected to folks, but you're not sure that anyone's available in your area, you can also call or email our office, and we may be able to connect you with local folks who aren't publicly listed in your area. Yeah, so meet a local group, find a local group, or start a local group. If there are new groups that want to get started, we would love to get to know you. And if affiliation with NWTRC works for your organization and works for us, we are definitely open to having more folks in our network. So again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We will be offering again another webinar next Saturday, um, February 25th, on our collective redirection initiative that several of our local affiliates are taking on. And so please register for that. Again, it's at tinyurl.com/WTR webinars, the same link that you used to register for this webinar. So thanks so much for joining us. Please contact us directly with further questions. Connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter. If you are interested in learning more about war tax resistance or getting started, we hope that we'll hear from you. So take care, everyone. Have a great day, and we hope to hear from you again soon.